Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Backlog Banter. My name is Tucker Hazell, and this is Dev Dive, the premier developer interview show on the internet. Of course, I am very excited to be talking to a different kind of guy today. This is Al Lowe, the creator of the Leisure Suit Larry series, something that I have recently gotten into, and I'm going to talk about my sort of story with that. But I'm very excited, Al, to talk to you, as I think I'm probably going to be coming at this from a slightly different angle than the people that usually interview you about these games. Because if you look at my fresh youth face, I'm not someone that grew up with these games. I'm not someone that grew up in that era. They were way before I was born. But as someone very passionate about video game history and the ways in which development and different design trends have happened over the years, I love going back and exploring things. And you were there as things were sort of starting, and so I'm really excited to pick your brain about the comedy that went into the early Leisure Suit Larry games, the way that your sense of humor and history as a teacher and as a musician went into making these. I mean, you're a unique guy, and the Leisure Suit Larry games are very, very unique. As someone who approached when you were designing games, approached games in a very different way than other people, what would you say makes the Leisure Suit Larry games different in your eyes from the many other Sierra adventure games that you were putting out around that time?
Well, my goal with the games was to make people laugh. Sex has always been an awkward topic and got a lot of laughs on TV and in movies. And I thought, why aren't there any games that have a sexy bent to them? I think it was the fifth game before I actually used a swear word. I mean, they were very clean. There was a lot of innuendo, but as far as games go today, they were mild and tame.
Yeah, so I recently discovered these games and played through the first three Leisure Suit Larry games. I played the VGA remake of the first one, and then I played 2 and 3 as well. And they were very different for me. Again, as someone who did not grow up with this kind of game, it's kind of interesting to go back and sort of learn the vocabulary of interacting with a game like that, because the text parsers and the adventure game clicking and combining things and the way that the puzzles are designed, it's very different from. I mean, I grew up with games that were designed 20 years after that. So, as someone who was creating games a much longer time ago than the games are being made now, what's your history with playing games since you were designing the Larry series back in the 80s and 90s?
In the 70s, I played a lot of arcade games, video games and stuff with my son. And when we got an Apple II, which I think was 1979, we discovered a couple of games then. We both liked adventure games. He couldn't read, he wasn't old enough to read yet, but I could read the games to him. But he would come up with good ideas of a way to solve puzzles. And so we could play those games together and both enjoy them. And so I got into adventure games, and I thought that it looked like something that I could do. I had been a music teacher and got involved with computers in 77, I think it was, started programming to make my job easier. I realized that what everybody does nowadays, I mean, this sounds silly because it's so obvious, but back then it wasn't obvious. But I figured out that because I was lazy, I could have the computer do a lot of things that I didn't enjoy doing. And also because the school district was tight on money, I was in a supervisory role, but they didn't give me a secretary. So I had to do a lot of paperwork. So I got into computers as soon as I was able. This was before Excel came out, before spreadsheets. And it was really an eye-opening experience, and realized that I could use computers to make my job easier. But what it did was teach me how to program. And then I went to a show that was one of the early computing shows. But what I saw was, my God, the educational market is just primitive. And I'd been used to playing games that were, a little more sophisticated. And so I thought, well, I know how to program. So I'll just kind of put that all together. And went home and wrote a couple of educational games in a few months and started selling educational games that were a lot like adventure games that I had played, but very simplified so that kids could play them without an adult. It was literally press the space bar to change choices on the menu, press the enter key to choose and move on, and the arrow keys to move around in the map. But they sold, and they were pretty successful. And Sierra at that time was called Online Systems, and Ken and Roberta Williams saw the games and liked them and said, "This would be perfect. We want to do an educational division. So why don't you be our educational division? And we'll sell your games and we'll make some other ones." And okay, that sounds great. So that's what I did. That's how I got into it. I literally created, packaged, did all the writing, and
Approaching games as an educator, as someone who had been teaching people before you started creating software or games, I think it's an interesting and very unique perspective to come from, because not a lot of people are teachers that end up going on to make games. And I'm curious, for me, I haven't played any of your educational games, and of course, those are designed in a way for to be approachable to children. How do you think that informed the design of the Leisure Suit Larry games that are much more geared towards an adult sense of humor and a more complicated design structure? But do you think there was any way in the way you designed puzzles or designed the entry into the game that came from your background as a teacher?
I think more of it came from my background as a jazz musician and playing nightclubs and watching guys try to pick up women in bars and fail. And I think that was more the inspiration than, although I think I did teach a lot of kids about prophylactics.
Another element of your games that are very unique is the comedic sense of humor. Your sense of humor really comes through in the way that the games are paced, the puzzles, the writing, the characters, the visuals. And I'm curious, in terms of your inspirations for comedy before you were making these Shoot Larry games, are there any movies or other comedic games that went into inspiring you to make something that was funny, like that to be your primary way to express yourself as a creator?
What I learned was, I guess it was a philosophy that Ken Williams taught me, which was hit the ball where they ain't. That's an old baseball phrase that means don't do what everybody else is doing, do something different. And so he would go, literally, he and I would go to the video stores back then that you could rent videotapes. And we would look around at all the different shelves, and, space stories were well represented. And knights of old and sandals and crap, that was well represented. But there was nothing else. There was no current day stories, cowboy stories. There were no detectives or spies or any of that stuff. None of that existed. So we got the bright idea that what we should do is do something that nobody else was doing.
Sort of process of elimination.
Well, yeah, but it's amazing how few people do that. Particularly seems like today. They see what game was successful, and then they say, "Well, I'm going to do one like that, only a little better." And that was not the approach we took. We did it differently.
Yeah, and it seems like another element of the games that make them unique is again the sense of humor. And you were saying earlier, not a lot of games were approaching games in a comedic way and trying to have jokes and a sense of humor. So, it for creating the Leisure Suit Larry games, what were your comedic inspirations? Did you have a favorite comedian? Did you have favorite comedic movies that you were watching around that time that were like, man, that kind of keyed you into your sense of humor?
I would have to say everyone. I was a big comedy fan. I would always watch comedians on television, and I enjoyed comedy movies. And I think that was one of the reasons why I thought that a comedy game would work, because I mean, people go to comedy movies, they buy comedy books, they watch comedy on TV. Why would computers be different? Gosh, I loved everybody from Abbott and Costello Rodney Dangerfield and Robin Williams and George Carlin. I was a big George Carlin fan, and I can't really name one, but there are very few that aren't. I would say it'd be tough to find somebody who wasn't. And plus, you got to understand, I didn't know how to create a comedy game. There were no molds to follow. There were no games that were really funny. The basis of Larry was that in the late 70s, Sierra, which was then Online Systems, published a game called Soft Porn, which was a text only adventure game. And it was a huge hit when Time magazine started its column on home computers. it was the featured article in Time magazine about this game that people were playing, and it was a big hit, sold lots of copies, and everybody I knew had a pirated version because the copy protection wasn't any good. So it was like a number one hit in its day. Well, when Sierra got access to the rights to the Disney characters, Disney kind of said, "Wait a minute, we don't want Mickey in the same catalog as soft porn," and soft porn had seen its day, and so we dropped soft porn and went with the mouse. But when the mouse was done, and we realized, oh, if we do games for Disney, Disney gets all the money, and we do all the work. So our games were selling just as well without Disney characters. So why are we paying Disney a huge royalty when we could just do it ourselves? And so that's what we did. Sierra dropped the Disney characters, and I was talking with Ken about what do you think I should do next? And he said, well, soft porn was a big hit. Maybe you could do an updated version of that with graphics and our new look interpreter and stuff. Well, I said, all right, I can't remember it, but I'll take it home and play it and see. And I played it, and I came back to report on my progress. I just offhandedly said, "Oh God, Ken, this game is so out of date. It should be wearing a leisure suit." And I got a laugh. And I said, "The only way I could do an updated version of this game is if you let me make fun of it. I think I could mock it and get some laughs out of it." And he said, "Oh, that'd be great. Let's do a comedy." And I said, "Okay." So he was a comic fan too. Anyway, so that's what I did, but I didn't really know how to do that. So I had a basic outline of scenes and puzzles. So I kept that. I threw away all the text and all the other stuff that had been written for the game, all the code. And we started from scratch and did a game. We added a protagonist. The original game had no central character. It spoke in this weird AI kind of tone of "I am your puppet master. I will do anything you tell me." So that's what I did. And as I thought of something, I thought, well, maybe somebody would find that funny. I would stick that in.
I think my favorite thing, and the most surprising thing to me about playing Leisure Suit Larry 1 was the sense of comedic timing that obviously, as you're saying, was rare in games at that time. And it must have been pretty difficult to translate comedic timing and punchlines into an interactive medium where you don't know if the player is going to do this or that. And so you have to write jokes that work in multiple ways. But I think, again, my favorite part of that game was the fact that I felt setups and punchlines, and I felt a sense of timing for things. And I think the specific moment that really sticks out to me in, again, for Larry 1, I played the VGA remake, was the first thing that I encountered that I thought was hilarious was the moose head in Lefty's bar is just a big moose head. It's, it's a stuffed thing, whatever. But you go on the other side of the wall and it turns out it's just a moose sticking its head through the wall. And that doesn't come until 15 minutes later after I've seen the moose head for the first time. And so it felt like there was a long tail setup and then a punchline, which is it's a subversion. It's not exactly what you think it is. It's just a moose sticking its head through the wall.
I'd like to give credit to Mark Crow for that. He did all the graphics in that game. You got to understand, that game was created before there was a Photoshop. So when you think about that, you go, well, wait, hasn't there always been Photoshop? But we had to develop, not I didn't, but people smarter than I, developed tools to create images on the screen. And then to animate a character, they had to create an animation tool, and they had to create a music tool and a sound effects tool. And all these things were specific to the Sierra engine. There were very few people who knew how to use these tools. And when it came time for me to do this game, there were no artists that were available. So they talked to Mark Crow, who was also developing Space Quest, and they said, "Mark, we don't want you to stop working on Space Quest. So work on that all day, and then if work on Larry in the evenings and weekends, and we'll give you a percentage on top of the game." And so Mark, while doing Space Quest, created every graphic background, designed the box, created the front cover out of paper cutouts, all that stuff in 1 month of weekends and evenings.
Wow, incredibly impressive. Yeah, and it was not only the visual gags, which I think are plentiful and are plentiful in all of the Larry games, but also the writing, which I know that you had more of a hand in, and I do want to commend your sense of comedic timing because there are moments of writing punchlines and writing things that I thought were really really funny. And one thing again, as an interactive medium that I thought was very unique is where you would allow the player to type in whatever they wanted and then you would spit that back out at them, a couple minutes later, maybe. There's the scene on the phone in Larry One where you say all the things that you like out of your favorite lover, and it's not until 5 minutes later, and I'd basically forgotten about that at that point. But then you get another callback, and it spits things back out at you. And I'd said some ridiculous things in mine. I said that the name of my lover was Larry, and that my favorite part of their body was eyebrows, and like I said some crazy things. And then when the game spat that back out at me, I wasn't expecting it. And so it was kind of a sucker punch, a writing sucker punch, but that came from my own trying to Mad Libs and sort of game the system, but also the comedic timing of let's wait a little bit and then we'll use the funny writing to mix that in with whatever the player said. And then there was a punchline. And so I really felt the setup of, oh, what is this? And then, oh, there is a punchline to it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think you hit it right on the nose. We used to play Mad Libs, back in the day, and that was just a way I thought, well, maybe somebody will catch this.
The fun part about that is you almost don't know that you're playing Mad Libs at the time, and so when it does the Mad Libs back to you, you're like, "Oh, I didn't even expect
Yeah,
that to
good.
happen," which is a lot funnier than Mad Libs, which you can have fun with Mad Libs, but you know that you're doing
Sure.
Mad Libs at the time, so it's a interactive subversion of that that I thought was really funny, and also another thing that sets the comedy apart, in the Larry games that I have played, I have not played all of them, but I played 1, 2, and 3, is the fourth wall breaking, which is something that the series kind of became notorious for at the end of the first game when Ken Williams, CEO of Sierra Entertainment, comes out and gives you a whole spiel about how the game was created. And then at the end of the third one, when Patty and Larry end up at Sierra and they're talking to Roberta directing King's Quest, it's like, this is insane. I mean, this is just a totally loopy, off the wall thing that I can't even really think of any other games even since that have broken the fourth wall to that level. What in your mind caused you to want to break the fourth wall in that way? You're like, well, let's just bring the player in and reference Sierra all the time and then have these really funny, totally off the wall endings. What went into that?
That was a direct inspiration from Blazing Saddles.
Oh,
The
I
end of
love that
Blazing
movie. Yeah.
Saddles when they fall into the studio and they're doing the Busby Berkeley dance routine and the horses are riding through the fountain. I mean, that whole thing was just crazy, and I loved that. And so I thought, I wonder if I could do the same thing. And Sierra had several series going at that time, and I thought, well, this will be, I can show each of those game development groups. But yeah, that was a fun thing. But I did a terrible thing. You only played the first three games. I finished it all up, and Larry was happy and married and had a good job and a good house and was content because I thought you only did three of anything. I had never seen a series of books or movies that had more than three parts. And so I thought, oh, this will be a trilogy. It's the last game of the series. I'll go do something else. And so I tied everything up, put a big bow on it, and said, "That's it. I'm done with Larry. There's no more of these. I'll do something else now." The problem was that the damn games just kept selling, and the sales force came back and said, "What do you mean you're not going to do another Larry? You got to do another one." And so I was really perplexed because I had no way to get this guy out of this situation and into another adventure. And so I went up to visit somebody at Sierra, or some meeting, and ran into a woman in the hallway. And she said, "Oh, what are you working on now, Al? Larry 4?" And I, like a smartass, said, "No, Larry 5. Of course I'm working on Larry." Hey, wait a minute. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe I should work on Larry 5 instead of 4, and just assume that things happened in 4 that nobody knows about. And so that became a running gag in Larry 5 of, oh, you remember this happening in Larry 4. But of course, I never did a game, and there was never even a document for it. It was just always a joke between us. But it ended up being a great idea because we got in the heads of the sales departments. At that time, games were sold retail, and buyers often would place orders for many thousands of games. Well, every time the sales guys went in to say, "Oh yeah, we've got Larry 5 coming out," their universal response was, "Wait a minute, Larry 5? I don't think I played Larry 4." And so we got them. We had them. We hooked their brain, and everybody wanted to see what would happen with that. And as far as I know, I'm the only guy who's ever skipped one of the sequels.
Well, it's interesting actually. There is one series that has since done that, and that is there's another sort of comedic game called Goat Simulator, where you play as a goat and you run around this world and you headbutt people. And Goat Simulator came out in 2011, I think, and 2 years ago they put out Goat Simulator 3, and there was never a Goat Simulator 2. And so that was a really funny moment where they're just like, "Hey, we're just skipping in another comedic series," and that kind of brings me to another question of these games are so unique. Your sense of humor is so unique, and I would bet that there were a lot of people that played these and were inspired by them. Are there any creators, any game creators, any movie directors, any writers that have come to you over the years and said that Leisure Suit Larry was something that inspired them to make their own comedy movies, games, whatever?
Not specifically, but I'm pretty sure the 40-year-old virgin. Uh,
Oh, yeah, I would
I
say
mean, if that
so.
wasn't a Larry story, I don't know what was. Just from every puzzle in that thing, because people told me about it. Somebody saw it and they said, "Oh my God, somebody's done a Larry movie," and except with Steve Carell. So
Yeah, and that is a funny movie, and of course there are some other adult childish characters, and then I think that Leisure Larry is a great one of those, and one of the few in video games which still sets it apart to this day because no one else has quite recreated that energy, and I think that it's because it came from a time when putting sex in games, putting these kind of more adult themes in games was very new, and it wasn't really recreated. I mean, there have been adult games and violent games and games with sex and Grand Theft Auto and things, but a sex comedy in games is something that no one else has really tried.
well, comedy's hard. You don't know what a player has seen before or hasn't. And so if you reference something they haven't learned yet, well, that's a problem. So you have to be very careful when you're designing and writing so that you don't get things mixed up.
Yeah. Another question that I have about the development of these games is regarding how many platforms they were ported to. The first Larry game, I've got the Wikipedia pulled up here, was put on the MS DOS, Amiga, Apple II, Apple II GS, Mac, Atari ST, and the Tandy Color Computer 3. And that's a mouthful. That's a long list of different platforms that game was eventually made available on. And I'm curious for you, as someone who works so heavily on the game and programming it and writing all the things, what was it like making the same game on all these different platforms that have slightly different requirements and slightly different sound chips and things? What was the process that went into making a game across a bunch of different hardware like that?
Personally, I ignored it. I did the version for the IBM PC. That was our target market. And once I got that working and done, then we would hand it to somebody else at Sierra and they would translate it to the other computers. I wrote the script and did the original. We got it all done. And then we handed it to somebody, and their job was to make it run on the Macintosh.
Yeah, and another thing about the technology, evolving technology at the time, is that, as you mentioned earlier, with Leisure Suit Larry being a remake in sorts of soft porn adventure, and then I mentioned the VGA remake that had better graphics, and you were talking about the art that was done for that. This game has been remade technically two times, and then technically it is a remake in and of itself. And I find that process very interesting because in the current games industry, there is a lot of people complaining about, oh, we're always remaking games. And they usually feel like it's more of a modern thing of just re releasing games and remaking games. But it's something that goes back to your days. And I don't think it's a bad thing myself, but I'm curious back in the day when you were making soft porn adventure again, and it's largely based on the structure and puzzles of soft porn adventure. Were there any people that reacted sort of negatively to the fact that it was a remake of an older game, because that's something very common today of, oh, that's just lazy game development. But I'm curious if that existed even back then.
I think Larry was so different from soft porn that it didn't really come up. Soft porn was really hard. It was text only, and he put in very few clues. So if you didn't guess the right thing, you got stumped and stopped, and you didn't finish. So I would say of all the copies of that game that were sold, maybe 1% got through it. It was, and of course, there was nowhere to look for help. We didn't hear much of anything at all about Larry One. 4 years later, the graphics had advanced from EGA to VGA, and that was a huge step up for us. And so Ken thought, well, maybe we can keep these games selling a little longer if we update the graphics and just make them look better. And so he did a VGA version of Space Quest 1 and King's Quest 1 and Larry. But it turned out that those three games didn't really sell very great. And so he stopped doing that. The idea originally was to do them all. Let's bring them all up to standards. But what happened was the sales kept chugging along. Whereas I think if we'd have kept the old graphics and the old look, the sales would have fallen off. But because we did the VGA versions, they continued to sell. And then in 2012, I had a producer come to me and say, if I could get the rights to Larry, would you do another Larry game? And I said, sure. It was great. I had fun. So he negotiated for the rights with the current IP owners. And they said, well, we don't want you to do a new game, but if you want to update the old game, we'll give you the rights to do that. Okay, so we upgraded Larry 1 once again, and this time we did it in, I think, 4K resolution and much better animation and so forth, and voiceovers. So all that was great, and that was called Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded. While that game sold well, the producer got everything together and got it going. Ended up keeping all the money and not paying the rest of us, and
Dang.
that kind of spoils your incentive for doing
Yeah.
more work for the guy. So he's out now and is gone. But it was a great time. We had fun doing the game, and we produced a game within a year, which I was proud of. If you haven't played any of these games and you're still sitting here listening to this, you should go get a copy of it somehow. Maybe Leisure Suit Larry Reloaded is still on Steam.
Yeah, it's still available.
Yeah, he's probably still collecting money from it. So
Yeah, yeah. And of course, you and the rest of the team are
of
not.
course, yeah.
Unfortunately. So, would you say you enjoy that process of going back and revisiting your own work and polishing it up and adding more jokes and things?
I did, but I would have enjoyed doing a new game more.
Of course, it's not necessarily anything that there's plans for, but you ever think about revisiting writing a game of some kind?
Well, it's odd. I did. I had a game that we developed, but we took it around to publishers, and they all suffered from that. Show us your comparables.
What other things are selling well that are like this? Yeah.
Yeah, we would show them the game, and they would love it, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, this is like the first game I've seen in months that I would actually play. It looks like great fun." And what are your comparables? And we'd say, "Well, we don't really have any. It was an action comedy, and there weren't really anything on the market like that then." So they all looked at it, and every publisher that we took it to said, "Nope, we're not going to do it. It's too risky. We can't risk the money." And so we ended up shutting down the development and throwing everything in the trash.
Yep. That's how it goes sometimes. The evolution of the video game market is something that I find very interesting as someone who's very passionate about video game history. And watching things kind of leave and go away and show up and trends, kind of cyclically happen. I mean, there certainly are a lot of smaller comedic games that are reasonably successful now, and they just made another Monkey Island game a couple of years ago, and so the market comes and goes, but unfortunately, unfortunate timing on that one where it's like, well,
Plus, you got to understand, Larry was a product of his time.
yeah,
To do a Larry game today, oh my God, it would be so wrong.
Hmm.
There's just, but it's not the same.
Yeah, of course, and I think that just to sort of close this out, I think what makes it games that I have played feel so special is that they are of their time, and they do have these references to things that I mean, I wasn't alive back then, and a lot of it goes over my head, but it has a unique feeling of being topical for the time that I think makes it sort of a time capsule in a unique way, and that combined with the fact that that first game has been remade, it kind of balances both sides of the coin, where the game does exist as a time capsule in an interesting way, but you're also able to update it. As someone who hadn't played a game like that, I think that the sense of humor is what drove me through it. Of yeah, okay, I have to sort of teach myself to interact with a game in a different way than I'm used to, but I'm always looking for that next punchline, that next funny line of dialogue from an NPC or Larry to do something silly. So the thing I want to commend you on as we close out here is that because of your sense of humor and your idea to make a game that was funny, even almost 40 years later after that first game was made, it still is accessible in an interesting way because it comedy is of its time, but I think also comedy can be timeless. And so going back and visiting a game that is structurally very different from what I'm used to, I was able to really get into it because it was funny. I mean, if I was playing any other kind of graphical adventure game or text adventure game, I probably would have felt a little more dry. And but I think your Larry Larry has life because I felt the comedic voice in it.
Well, good. I'm glad you liked it. And if you haven't played Larry 7,
Mm.
that's I think, my crown jewel.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
I didn't play it for 10 years, and somebody called me and said, emailed me and said, I can't get it to run on Windows XP or something. And I said, well, it should work. And so I pulled out a copy and loaded it up and ended up sitting playing for like an hour and a half, laughing at my own jokes that I had forgotten. I didn't remember what happened when you did these things. And it was like, hey, this game's pretty fun.
Yeah, and I plan to play through those other games that you created. I also want to play Freddy Farkas, which I think is looks really clever. And I want to I have been playing through these games and live streaming them on my YouTube channel, and I had my brother and a couple of my friends watching me as I was playing through Larry 3, which I just did a couple days ago. And it is very fun to sort of do it with friends and have them share ideas with me and laugh at the jokes together, and then be there to support me when I messed up a couple times and I had to replay like 30 minutes of the game.
No, save early, save often.
Trust me, I learned that lesson.
Let me add one thing. If you've sat through this long and watched this, come to my website, and I've got hundreds of pages of old stories about the old days at Sierra and how we did game development. And I've got music and animation and all sound effects and stuff that you can download. Everything's free, and I'm just happy to give back to the community that supported me.
Absolutely. I think that your website, which I'd spent some time exploring, is a really interesting resource for games history in a way that I don't think a lot of people take to preserve their own work. The games are downloadable there. The manuals are available in digital scans there that you can download as PDFs.
And the design documents.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't got into those. That's fun. Yeah, and I think that's a great way to approach it. And of course, it's you and your own work, so it's a little bit easier. But I appreciate that through a website that allows you to download things to modern hardware, your games are still accessible, and you want people to revisit them. There are a lot of even some Sierra games are not made available in that same way. There's some of them available on Steam, and some of them you can get online. But I was trying to find a couple of them, and I couldn't quite get it to work.
The good old games has got them. Most, I think, most of the stuff, but
Yeah, yeah, and I really appreciate that. But I like your website specifically because A, it's you, B, you know these games very well, and also the surrounding website has a sense of humor, and you've got all of your own other stuff on there as well.
okay, I guess it's time to quit.
Yep, there's the bell.
All
Thank you very
right.
much for joining me, and thank you everyone for watching.